Good evening. On behalf of Bay Bridge and our sponsoring partners, welcome to our second presentation on restorative justice. Special thanks to the United Methodist Church of Whitefish Bay for hosting this event, and I want to give a shout out to our additional sponsors, Micah, Wisdom, Expo, the community, From the Same Dust, a Baha'i group, Bayshore Lutheran Church, Christ Church Episcopal, Congregation Sinai, Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee, and Interfaith Restorative Practices Coalition. It's my honor to introduce Justice Janine Geske, my former professor at law school. Her career has been one of service, from her early years with the Legal Aid Society of Milwaukee through her tenure as a Milwaukee County Circuit Court judge, and then her years on the Wisconsin State Supreme Court. She has said yes when called upon, including as interim Milwaukee County Executive and interim Dean of Marquette University Law School. It has been at the law school where Janine Geske's passion for restorative justice has flourished. As a distinguished professor of law, she established the Restorative Justice Initiative, which today has been endowed as the Marquette Law School Andrew Center for Restorative Justice, and with gratitude to Sue and Louis Andrew. Classes and clinics introduced students to the practices and programs, including trips to the Green Bay prison, years of annual conferences with topics including school bullying, international terrorism, sex trafficking, domestic violence, and Native American traditions, to name a few. Justice Geske is an international speaker and teacher on restorative justice. From Ireland to Belgium and Turkey, among others, she has spoken, taught classes, and participated in seminars on restorative justice around the world. She is particularly well known for her work with the Catholic Church on facing the priest sex abuse scandals. The video on this issue that she produced has been used extensively as parishes come to terms with the harms done. Restorative justice as practiced and informed by Justice Geske is an approach not only to crime and victim impact, but can help repair harms within families and communities. Please join me in welcoming Janine Geske.
Thank you. Thank you, Corinthia. My husband describes that as not holding a job very long, so it's how you look at it, right? It's really my pleasure to be here to talk to you about restorative justice. Corinthia actually brought the syllabus along from the class. She was one of my first classes of restorative justice. What I thought I would do tonight is to take you through a little bit about how I became both knowledgeable and then impassioned about the use of restorative justice in lots of different settings. And it really began when I was a circuit court judge in Milwaukee. 9 of my 12 years on that bench were spent in criminal. My last assignment was full-time homicides and sexual assaults. And during that time, I believed it was important that I spend time with people who use the system. So I'd spent time with victim survivor groups and with community groups, but I also have taught in the prisons for over 20 years because I thought I ought to spend time where I was sending people to have some sense of what was happening in the institutions. You know, judges have sort of an idea of what they think is going to happen when they sentence, but really the judge has no power to say, to dictate what's going to happen in prison other than to send somebody there. And there's a sense sometimes that people are going to get immediately into treatment, and sometimes it's going to be 20 years at the tail end of their sentence. So, to be able to know those things, and I did a lot of judicial teaching during those years, so that was helpful for that. Well, I heard about restorative justice during that time, and the concept, which I will describe in a while, of a victim or a victim's family and an offender meeting face to face seemed ludicrous to me. And it seemed ludicrous to me because I'd sit in these cases and I would watch the mother of somebody who was murdered or somebody who was sexually assaulted weeping in the courtroom, and I'd see the defendant with his or her lawyer, and the thought of putting them together into a dialogue seemed absolutely crazy to me. And all I could think of was that victims were going to get re-victimized by going through that process. So I really had no interest in restorative justice, although I didn't realize working with offenders and with survivors and community, that is actually the makeup of restorative justice. And what happened to me was a teacher that I worked very closely with in Green Bay Correctional was having another former lawyer who was doing restorative justice, doing a 3-day restorative justice process, and she said, "You really need to watch this." And I said, "Okay." And I sat through those 3 days, and sometimes we look back at our lives and say there are those transformational moments when something happens, you encounter some experience, or maybe you travel to a third world country, or you do something and it absolutely changes how you see the world or what you think you ought to be doing. Well, that 3 days had that impact on me. And I just was just overwhelmed with what happened. And I'm going to describe for a few minutes what that looked like so you can have a better understanding. What happened then was that in a year or two, I took over that program and I ran it for 15 years. We ran it twice a year, and we're actually starting again now at Racine Correctional in October. We're going to do our first 3-day session. What that looked like was a makeup of a number of people who were incarcerated, often about 20, 25, and it was men in Green Bay, although we did some in Tachita as well. And so men who were incarcerated, we would bring in 3 survivors, and we call them surrogate survivors of violent crimes. And the reason they're surrogates is that they in fact have been victimized, but not by the people in the room. So they're not meeting the person that harmed them, they're meeting someone else who may have committed a crime like that. And then I would bring in community members, and I'd pick up people in all these speeches I give, and people would say, "Gee, I'd really like to go along." And we had this list, and I'd always bring some law students, I'd bring some community members. I brought some police came, some judges came, some prosecutors came. We had a bishop from Green Bay who came once. We had media come. And we would participate in the 3-day circle. Now I'm going to just take an aside here and give you my 4-minute lecture on restorative justice. As Corinthia knows, this is a semester-long course, so it's hard for me to do it in 4 minutes, but I will. Restorative justice is often described or represented by a triangle. And the 3 points of the triangle, at the top is victim survivor, and the second point is community, and the third point is the person who committed the harm. So you've got those 3 points, and they are the 3 important points in restorative justice. There are 3 questions you ask involving this. The first question is, who was harmed by what happened? Now I want you to notice that I'm talking harm and not crime, because a lot of things that are harmful in our culture and our society are not criminal. The only difference between criminal and harm is that the legislature has not made it criminal. But, as I say, a lot of people, whether it's, anything from racial profiling to discrimination to betrayal, I can go on and on and on about all the things that people do to each other that are harmful, that are not criminal. So restorative justice is to address harm. It's one of the reasons that it can be utilized in community and in schools and other places, because it doesn't necessarily deal with crime. Okay, so in defining this, we've got the triangle, and there are 3 fundamental questions you ask. The first question is, who was harmed? And I'm going to start with the victim survivor. Now, in a criminal case, as you probably, if you haven't been in a courtroom, at least seen on TV, the obligation of the state is to prove certain elements of a crime. So if we have an elderly woman, for example, who was burglarized and harmed, The only testimony she's going to give during that trial is that somebody entered her house without permission and stole something. Those are the elements of burglary. The fact that she doesn't sleep at night, that she no longer feels uncomfortable in her home, that she's afraid, that her children don't want her to live alone anymore, that the neighbors think maybe they should sell their house because it could have been their house, all those things are not relevant to a criminal case. The only place they may get relevant is at sentencing, and it really is just a tiny piece of the sentencing. So when you ask about, who was harmed, when we get back to this victim, there are all sorts of people and entities around the victim who've been harmed. If you have a sexual assault survivor, his or her partner, his or her children. I mean, there's one of the survivors I worked with said, I was angry. I took it out on my kids as though it was their fault. People have these, what I call ripples. I'm going to talk a lot about ripples, and it can ripple far and wide in terms of people that surround a survivor and are harmed. They may not be harmed in the same way, and they may not be harmed as badly, but sometimes it's even worse depending who they are and what the relationship is. So who is harmed? Who is harmed is community, and I define community as people and institutions and sometimes nations who do not know the victim, but they are impacted. So, for example, if you suddenly had a number of crimes happening in Whitefish Bay, even if you live in Whitefish Bay or you live in the area, it affects you. It affects you on how you live, whether you feel comfortable in your neighborhood. It affects racial profiling, if race seems to be a piece of it. It affects how comfortable people are. I talk about that on Marquette campus. We frequently, unfortunately, have a number of armed robberies that happen on campus. There is not particularly a co-ed, but even the males who are not impacted with thinking about when a car pulls up next to them on campus, whether somebody's going to come out and pull a gun on them. So community can be impacted in lots of different ways. As Corinthia mentioned, I do a lot with the Catholic Church, and I'm not going to spend time on that tonight, but I can tell you that the whole Catholic Church internationally has been impacted by the harms that happened, even though individual people that I work with may have never known a particular victim. But they know what happened, and they know, frankly, what the bad response of the institution was, and there's a lot of anger and loss of faith and all sorts of things that happen. So community can change in lots of ways. The biggest example is if you look at 9/11, right? 9/11 was a series of crimes on that day. They committed harm, incredible harm. The whole world changed, and it will never go back to what it was before. Every one of you have been impacted by what happened on 9/11, even though you may not have lost anybody in the towers, whether it's you going to the airport or whether it's trying to get into a country or visiting a federal building, and you could go on and on and on, not to mention some profiling of Muslims and other things that came as a result, the ripples of that. So community can be impacted in a large way. When you take the person or persons who committed the harm, and again, I'll say this is not always simple to identify these parties, especially if you're dealing with kids, because you can have people that are both causing harm and being victimized, and they can kind of go back and forth. But we're going to use a pure example tonight. So you've got somebody who committed harm. That person is going to have impact, but additionally, there's going to have to be accountability, and accountability can mean different things in different contexts. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I'm going to spend a little time tonight dealing with criminal cases. And accountability can include incarceration. It's not that we're going to simply not incarcerate anybody regardless of what they've done or what the harm is. But accountability can be broader in terms of what their obligations are to the community and to try to repair harm with the victim if it's appropriate. But there are the ripples around that person as well. And some of you may know somebody who's had a child charged with a crime or a relative charged with a crime. It impacts the family and the people that know that individual. And it can be a combination of everything from guilt. I mean, every time there's one of these school shootings, because I work in this field, I think about the parents of the shooter. You know, I think about what they're going through and thinking about what they should have done or could have done, or, you know, and maybe there's some with ill intent, and, you know, I'm not looking specifically at them, but they become pariahs. Particularly the more violent it is, the more the whole family is bad. And so the ripples can go through the family members, you know, and in their own way, in a lot of these shootings, they're also grieving the death of their son. It's usually a boy. And so there's deep impact that community doesn't do much with, but it certainly is something that happens. So you're saying who was harmed, and then what was the harm? I like to talk about, just for a really stark example of somebody who's been sexually assaulted. And I tell this story that some criminal defense lawyers would make a mistake sometimes in my court and argue that a rape victim wasn't harmed and or wasn't hurt. And after I was peeled off the ceiling and I had a little talk with them, they realized that wasn't an argument they should make. I knew what they were saying. What they were saying is there weren't cuts and bruises. But the lecture they would get is that cuts and bruises heal. The harm that's caused by a sexual assault is life-changing and devastating to anybody who has suffered that harm. And so, you know, or they'd make the argument, you know, well, at least he didn't jump out of the bushes, you know, it was somebody she knew. Again, the harm is much greater with somebody you know, because you can't trust anybody anymore. If it's somebody that jumped out of the bushes at night, you know, you're not going to be out at night. I mean, you think you can protect yourself. You might not be able to, but if it's somebody you trusted, your ability to trust anyone has really been damaged. And so when we're asking what the harm was, it's asking those questions that do not get asked in a criminal case. And the victim, the survivor, the people around them never have a voice as to be able to describe that to anybody other than a psychologist, a therapist, and maybe a lawyer if they have one. So you've got both the nature, you've got who's harmed and what was the harm. You know, one of the community harms that I talk about, and this is one that many of you will understand, and we faced it at Bayshore sometimes, and we faced it at Northridge, for those of you who are old enough to remember Northridge, or Capitol Court, if you remember Capitol Court. You have a series of crimes, and what happens is the whole shopping center goes, right? People don't want to shop there, stores get closed, they pull out. I mean, I just heard, you know, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I'm hearing Nordstrom's and all these stores are pulling out downtown San Francisco because of the crime that's happening in San Francisco. And so those are ripples that don't come to the criminal court, but they are real harms to the community that are happening because of some actions. And, you know, not only do the shopping centers close, but then the property values fall and, you know, people lose their jobs, and you can go on with sort of the ripple effect of the harm. The third question, which is sort of the restorative question, is what do we do to go forward to try to promote healing or to promote restoring, if that restoring isn't always appropriate. Sometimes there's nothing to restore, but it's a healing or helping particularly survivors move forward, but also the community to move forward. And I always put the community in sort of a dual role in my triangle, because not only are they part of the victim, but it has an obligation to help on the healing and restoring. And whether it's helping or trying to find ways to help survivors and victims, and we're not particularly good at that, by the way. You know, I can, again, using my example of the Catholic Church, many people who came forward and named priests were ostracized by people of goodwill who thought that they shouldn't be doing that, or it didn't happen, or whatever they thought. But it's true in a lot of cases. People are maybe support a survivor, but then we just kind of forget it. And I can tell you that that is so important, and I'll talk a few minutes, I'm going to go back to the prison. Most of the people who are incarcerated in our state prisons were victims as children. They were emotionally abused, physically abused, sexually abused. Not everyone, but many, many of them. And if we as community had done something to support them when they were children, maybe we wouldn't want to spend all this money incarcerating them, and we wouldn't have this wake of people who have been victimized by these individuals who are very angry and traumatized by what happened in their lives, and then unfortunately go and victimize others. So community has an obligation both in terms of the survivor, but also to work with people that have committed harm, and maybe it's in the institutions and maybe it's out of the institutions, but to help restore and have them held them to responsibility for doing good, and I'll give you examples of that in a few minutes. And so there are different models of restorative justice, and the two that I'm going to talk most about tonight are victim offender dialogues. I mentioned those, face-to-face meetings, the ones I thought would never happen, and they happen frequently. And the other is talking circles. And how many of you have been in a talking circle with a talking piece? Okay, a number of you have. That's based on Native American traditions, the idea of that we're all part of the community, we're all humans. I don't have time to go through all the details, but one of the hallmarks of those circles is a talking piece. And the native tribes often will use a eagle feather because it has deep spiritual meaning for them, or sometimes a talking stick that has lots of symbolism, and sometimes rabbit's fur and bells and different colors and all sorts of things everything has meaning on the talking stick. I use a lot of circles. Most of what I do is circle talk. And we call them healing circles, and we call them different things. And the premise behind it is that we're sitting together in a circle, and you're not hearing somebody lecture you for an hour, but we're all participating. And the circle keeper or the facilitator will ask some kind of question that's going to evoke storytelling. The heart and soul of restorative justice is storytelling. And what happens is I ask a question and I pass the talking piece to somebody next to me. They can give a story, a personal experience in answer to the question, and when they're done, they pass to the next person. No one can speak unless you have the talking piece. And that accomplishes a number of things. We listen in ways that us Americans are not particularly good at listening. We don't interrupt, we don't ask questions, we just sit back and we listen. The other is we're not busy trying to think about what we're going to say to that person because we're on the other side of the room, and by the time the talking piece gets there, it's going to be different anyway. So you kind of discard that. And you're able to have really very heart-to-heart, in some ways, intimate discussions about issues by using a talking piece. And, you know, to me, whether you're religious and call it spiritual, or whether you call it mystical, or whatever you call, amazing things happen in those circles with talking pieces. I have done hundreds and hundreds of them. As Corinthia has mentioned, I've done them around the world. And there's something about holding a talking piece and having the safety of that circle and being able to share stories. Okay, so I wanted you to understand that. I'm going to go back to the prison and just tell you just a few stories out of the prison. So I told you the kinds of people that we had in the circle. So we had people who were incarcerated, we had survivors, and we had community members and students. And we'd mix everybody up so that, you know, we didn't have all the incarcerated in one corner and all the community members there. We would sit and talk to each other. And I would give them a talk on restorative justice. And then I would ask them a question about just a storytelling. And the kind of question you ask is a question that anybody can answer. And I usually use a really simple question about, can you share a story when somebody deeply touched your life? Maybe it was a moment of great sorrow where somebody put an arm around you. Maybe it was a teacher who encouraged you. Maybe it was a neighbor who came over with something. Whatever it is, tell a story about some moment that you were deeply touched by someone else's actions. Well, everybody can share a story. And the things about storytelling is you can't argue with people's stories. You can argue with their opinions on things. So if I ask everybody's opinion on any topic, you know what happens, right? Town hall meeting, political meeting. You hear what happens when everybody's got their opinions. But let's ask, why do you have those opinions? Tell us a story in your life that helps shape that opinion, and you get a very different answer. And what happens is people get to know each other at a more human, fundamental level than simply the idea of arguing. So we do the circle, and we do a bunch of activities, sort of community building activities that first day. I won't bother explaining them. The second day, the survivors talk. And unlike the courtroom, each of them take probably an hour and a half, 2 hours each to talk about their lives. And I'm just going to tell you about 2 of them tonight. And I've had a number of different survivors at different times. The one who's influenced me the most is a woman by the name of Lynn. She's a bunch older now, but she was a young mother and wife of a police officer in the city of Eau Claire. And her husband liked being a police officer. He saw it as a helping profession. She had 2 little children. One night, he said goodbye to her, and she said, "Honey, be careful," which is what she said every night. And he said, "Don't worry, God and I are like this." And he walked out. And she takes us through the night of putting the children to bed and going to sleep, and 3 o'clock in the morning, bam, 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 at the front door. And she knew it was going to be bad news. Her husband had a key, and it was going to be bad news. And so, she takes us through pulling the covers over her head, hoping it's a nightmare. And so, it's all the details that you never hear in a courtroom or even in a general discussion by a victim. And she takes us through going down to the door, and the lieutenant with his ashen face saying, "We got to get to the hospital. Bob's been shot, and the woman officer going to stay with the children." And she talks about her racing heart. You've probably experienced that, racing to a hospital in the middle of the night, wondering what you're going to find and what's happened. And she talks about getting in and pushing her way into the emergency room. Now, victims have really heightened senses as to things happening around them, even though they may not remember certain details of what happened. So she's real aware of the white walls and the bright lights in the hospital. And in the ER, her husband is laid on the table. His chest is cut open. They literally have his heart in their hands, and they're pouring blood into him as fast as it's pouring out. And she said they didn't even see her. And she walked around and looked down at him from his head and said, "I knew he was dead." And so she kissed him on the top of the head, and she walked out. And she's trying to take this in as she walks down the hall, and she thinks, what am I going to tell the children? They just kissed their daddy goodnight a couple hours ago. And what do I do, and where do I go? And trying to, just try to take in the fact that her husband has been murdered. And as she's walking, she's hearing squeaking noises. And she's trying to figure out what that is. She's just the senses are very acute. And she looks down and looks behind her, and she sees that her tennis shoes are tracking her husband's blood down the linoleum floor in the hospital. To this day, if she walks across a gym floor with tennis shoes and it squeaks, it's a flashback. It's a trigger. Now, it's many years later. It's not something that sets her off for hours. But I can tell you that even after she's told us that story, sometime in the 3 days, one of the men is going to walk across the grass at the prison and have his tennis shoes wet, and is going to walk in, and it's going to squeak, and the whole room's going to go quiet, because we understand what that meant to her. And she takes us through having to tell the children. Her 4-year-old child, who didn't suck her thumb anymore, went back to sucking her thumb for 2 years. And she takes us through the whole journey of the criminal prosecution. She was treated very badly by the prosecutor. They plea bargained the case down. It was a domestic violence call. that got him killed. The bullet hit 1 inch below his bulletproof vest, and the man was going to kill the child of the woman he'd been beating, and the officer, Bob, stepped in between them and took the bullet himself. The shelter up in Eau Claire is named after him. The other person that I'm going to tell you a little about is a woman by the name of Kim, and she's a survivor of sexual assault. She's a school teacher. She's a jogger. She was living not in Wisconsin at the time, and she was jogging early one morning before she went to school. Her husband was with their little daughter, and she was about 9 weeks pregnant. And she said, I was always very careful when I was running. I tried to stay alert. I didn't listen to music. And yet, out of the blue, she suddenly had a gun to her head, and she didn't see it coming. And she said, I didn't even know what he wanted. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. I mean, it didn't even occur to her that he wanted to assault her. And anyway, she takes us through the detail with the gun always pointed and touching her body. He gets her into a truck. He takes her to some woods. And then she tells people in the circle what it felt like to have to strip naked in front of this stranger at gunpoint, and then lay down, and then have him sexually assault her. And she talks about something that survivors often talk about on sexual assault, that their mind kind of leaves their body and kind of floats over their body, trying to separate themselves from what physically is happening to their bodies. He held the gun on her, and after he was done, he said, when I brought you here, I was going to leave you dead. What am I going to do with you? And she said she just started talking. She started, I'm not going to tell anybody. My husband will never believe that it wasn't consensual. He would be mad. I'm pregnant. I've got a little girl. I mean, she's saying anything she can to hopefully jog him from pulling the trigger. He didn't pull the trigger, obviously. She's telling us the story. She doesn't know why. But he let her get dressed, still at gunpoint, took her in the truck, and she still thought he might take her somewhere to kill her, and he eventually let her go, but warned her that if she told anybody, he was going to come back and kill her little girl, her husband, and her. And so she did not talk to the police for over a week. Her husband found her in a fetal position in the woods behind the house when he was looking for her. And the end story of this is this guy tried to assault another young woman and was caught and ultimately convicted. For her, the worst part of it was that this guy held her life in his hands with a gun, that any second he could have pulled that trigger. And so she shares those stories. Well, so you hear these stories, and they're stories that I, as a judge who've heard hundreds of cases, have never heard before. And not to say that the community members haven't heard those things before. Some of them have experienced similar things. Sometimes we've got other survivors in the group. And the people who are incarcerated have not heard those stories before. And they are deeply moved by the courage and bravery of those survivors to come into that institution and tell those stories. And I can tell you that what happens is we start talking about the harm that happens with a crime. And, suddenly we're not talking about whether the criminal justice system is unfair or whether they've been wrongfully convicted or anything else. We're talking about the harmed human beings. And I can tell you that a lot of people who are incarcerated for having committed a homicide, often it's a gang fight or two drug dealers or two gang members. And the mindset is a little bit, well, we were shooting at each other and one of us maybe die and the other go to prison, whichever one it was. But they never think about the children of the person who was killed. They never think about the mother. We've had mothers come and describe how they've gone to the funeral parlor every day for a year after their son had his service and was buried. And they don't think about their own children as victims, which they are. And so that's one place where many of them go. We don't ask what they've been convicted of. They often will share it over the 3 days. I've had people that I've sentenced. There's only one or two that I've recognized. I always tell this story. I was sitting next to a guy and I said, "Oh, you from Milwaukee?" And he said, "Yeah, you put me here." And it was a little bit of a conversation stopper, you know. It's kind of like, oh, well, how is it? You know. But I've never had problems. You know, we're in the room with no guards. We're with some of the teachers and other staff from the prison, but we've never had problems with any of them. But they think about maybe victims of that they've not even been crimes they've not been convicted of, but thinking about the children and the people and the ripples, and they think about their children. And the other piece, they think about that, and then they think about the incredible bravery and courage of these survivors. They love these survivors. They are just so in admiration of them. And what they are particularly taken with is the courage of these survivors to come into an institution where people have committed similar crimes and to sit with them for 3 days and tell these stories. I can tell you that the survivors love participating in these because they see the impact of their stories on the people in the circle, which is enormous. And that brings healing to them to listen and watch that. But one of the reasons they have such admiration for these survivors, as I mentioned before, many of them have seen and experienced incredible violence themselves. And whether it's seeing a mother shot between the eyes, or whether it's holding your brother as he was killed, or having your little sister raped by an uncle, or whatever the story is, they can then talk about the anger and the rage. And I have to say that these survivors, including Lynn, will talk about the anger and the rage they had after they were victimized. I mean, that's the reaction, right, is to be really angry about what happened. Now, if I have time, I'll talk to you about the forgiveness topic, which was called the F word in the victims' world. But the men think that these victims have forgiven the offenders, and none of them talk about forgiveness. They don't talk about forgiveness. Now, sometimes they do in the victim-offender dialogues, but they don't. But they talk, you know, about the impact because they want to share their stories. And we had one man crochet little purple hearts for each of the survivors after one of the meetings. I have them do some project on the second night because they don't sleep. I always tell them they're not going to sleep. They go, yeah, Judge, sure. And then they come in the next morning and said, I didn't sleep. And I said, I know. Because for the first time, sometimes in 10 years, because they've been there for a long time, thinking about the crime and the people they hurt, and also thinking about their own pain. And we do another circle, and we do some projects. We actually do a little skit at the end, which turns out to be funny. And we end the 3 days with everybody in the circle pledging what one specific thing we're going to do as a result of what we've heard and experienced over the 3 days. And it's that little restoration. And then a former student of mine who now runs the Restorative Justice Program at University of Wisconsin Law School comes in the next week and spends some more time with them to help them process. Well, I spent so much time on this topic because everything I've done in restorative justice is based on what I've learned in that prison. And learning the importance of the storytelling, learning the impact of sharing, learning the impact of not talking about opinions and structures and all those things that are important, but actually to talk about personal stories. And so we do that. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on victim-offender dialogues because I mentioned it earlier. I was wrong. There are a lot of survivors of violent crime who are interested in meeting face-to-face with the person who committed the crime. It is often long time afterwards. I mean, I think probably the earliest I've done a homicide is 3 years after conviction. I've done one as long as there was a man who was 40 years out from the crime. He's a professor out in California and an advocate against the death penalty and works with prisoners. But when he was a little boy, his sister in Racine was abducted, assaulted, and stuffed into a refrigerator on her way to school. And after 40 years, he wanted to sit down and talk to the person who was convicted, who is still incarcerated today. And so that's sort of the expanse. Why do people want to talk? Because I thought, why would a victim want to talk? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is they want the offender, particularly in a homicide, to know who it was they killed. What did they take from our family? Who was it, what was his or her personality, or what that they did. I've done a number of homicide by intoxicated user cases, and one of the families did a whole videotape. It was a college junior who was killed, a young woman. They created a video with her first communion picture, or baptism pictures, and first communion, and birthdays, and Christmas, and all these photos all through her life up to the point where she was killed. They wanted him, the driver, who went to prison and was out by the time we were doing this, to see who he killed. We had an 8x10 picture of her on the table, and they wanted him to know. They also wanted to know details. They wanted to know what possessed you that night, what were you thinking. Sometimes we've done drunk driving homicides when it's a passenger, right? It's a friend of the driver. And so then often the mother or the father of the person who died wants to know what happened before the accident. What were they talking about? Were they in a good mood? How much had they been drinking? Were they worried? Just they want to know details. Now, you might think, like I did, well, what if the details are really awful? I mean, do you really want to know that? And everyone answers the same when I ask that question. They'll say, the person who committed the crime cannot hurt me any more than they already have. I need to know what happened. Because in my mind, I am looking at these different scenarios all the time and wondering, did this happen? Did that happen? Did he suffer? Did he this? Did he that? And I just want to know what happened, even if it's bad. There is a wonderful, horrible story. It's horrible, the crime. And it involved two women that I know pretty well from Texas. And a young woman was abducted. She was pregnant. She had a little girl already. She was abducted. She was tortured. She was raped. And she was murdered and left on the side of the road. And 18 years later, the mother of the victim and the daughter of the victim, who now was 18 herself, wanted to meet with one of the offenders who was incarcerated. And there's actually a video of it. And he was very slow intellectually, very remorseful, as you can be for doing something like that. He was high on drugs at the time. And they had two fundamental questions that they wanted to ask. One was from their brother and son. The family thought this was nuts, the rest of the family, that these two women wanted to go see him. They didn't understand it. But the mother said to her son, "Is there something you want me to ask him?" And he said, "Well, there really is, and this is 18 years later. You know how I always fixed my sister's car? I always wonder if it broke down, and that's why she was abducted." So he had been living with that, even though we all know, even if the car had become disabled, it wasn't his fault that this happened, but he was living with that. And the second thing that the mother and daughter wanted to know is they wanted to know her last words. They wanted to know what she said before she died. And they went in and, they had a whole long, several hours of dialogue, but the question about the car was, her car didn't break down. She was in a gas station, they were in a gas station, they struck up a conversation, they pretended they were lost. She volunteered to hop in the car and to help them. And so 18 years later, he gets an answer to know that, if he had that feeling, he had nothing to do with what happened. The last words is really an emotional moment, because what the offender said was, she looked up at us and said, "I forgive you and God will forgive you," and she died. And you see the mother and the granddaughter falling into each other's arms, weeping at hearing that word, the last words. But the mother later in an interview said, actually, that brought her some peace to know that her daughter was at peace the moment she died, that she had the wherewithal to talk about forgiving him, and that God would forgive him. And so, those kinds of things are just, They're incredible. And there are so many stories, and I don't want to take up the whole night because I know my time is going, but of victim offender dialogues that have been successful. And I consider them successful if they meet expectations, whatever that means. Just so you know, they're all victim initiated or survivor initiated. We don't do one of these meetings if an offender has asked, unless a victim has indicated that she or he is interested in doing this, because you don't want to contact the victim out of the blue and say, by the way, you know, the person that murdered your daughter would really like to have a conversation, because you don't know what that's going to do to somebody. So it really is survivor initiated. The other thing, it takes anywhere from 6 months to 2 years to prep them. We spend a lot of time working back and forth, listening to people and to make sure, and even though Jerry Springer recently died, I'd say I don't want a Jerry Springer moment, right? That's not what, that's, you know, we want to make sure everybody is safe. And one of the things we always call this is that we're having a very difficult conversation in a safe environment. And that's really one of the roles of the facilitator. The forgiveness thing, I just want to mention that, and you heard me mention it before. Forgiveness is one of those hot button words that mean different things to different people. For some people, forgiveness means, oh, it's okay, I don't mind. It's, you know, and if that is somebody's definition of forgiveness, it doesn't fit into any traumatic event. I mean, you know, that doesn't work. For some people, it's very religious based, but I've seen people who, you know, say I forgive, and yet understandably are full of rage and anger, and you know, they have a lot to work through. There are people who tell offenders, I was hoping I could forgive you today and I can't, or I'll never forgive you, or they don't say anything. And that's really what I prep them to say, nothing if they don't want to say anything about forgiveness, because it has all these different meanings. For me, forgiveness really is about the person who's forgiving, not about the recipient. And it becomes obvious and important when you've got a victim, somebody who's been harmed, and they never catch the offender, or somebody who's been molested by a dad and the dad is deceased. You know, it doesn't have to be expressed, it has to be something in the heart of the survivor. And I'm just going to tell you one quick story, and then I'm going to move into the community circles. But I was doing a homicide by intoxicated user, and there were 3 family members related to the victim. And they were all different places, which is not unusual. People are different, you know, some people are angry, some people have kind of accepted it, some people are, you know, there are just all, families travel different routes on these traumatic events. And there was a daughter who was a sister of the victim who said, you know, I don't even want to see him, but I want to be there with my parents when they meet with him. So I'm going to go in, and I said, that's fine. You don't have to talk to him. You don't have to look at him. If you want to leave the room at any point, feel free to do it, but, you know, it's up to you whether you want to be in there. She said, I want to be in there. So we were in the room, and they were talking, the young man and the parents, and she was looking down at the ground. Now, this is the one that was the video that I told you about before. And at some point, the parents put the video on the wall, and I was sitting with my back to the video because I'd seen it already, and I was watching them. And the young man the tears were just running down his cheek as he was meeting the woman that he killed through this video. And I looked over at the sister, and she, for the first time, was starting to look up and looked at him and saw him crying. And she reached down to her purse and grabbed a wad of Kleenex and took it and passed it across to him on the table. Another colleague and I that do this work described that as the energy of forgiveness. It doesn't mean big forgiveness, but it's a humanization and a softening of what was there before. And you see that a lot when people have this opportunity. People that go through the criminal justice system never have that opportunity. But I gave a talk at noon today to civil lawyers, people who do litigation. I said, it's no different. You know, I've done many civil cases where everything on a medical malpractice where a baby has died, to a drowning case, to other civil litigations where the parties want, or the lawyers help set up, a dialogue that they can ask each other those very important questions that have nothing to do with the litigation. I mean, they have a little to do with it, but not a lot. They want answers to their questions to help them to try to move forward. Okay, so I'm going to spend the last few minutes to talk about more widespread use. The biggest expansion of restorative justice is in the schools. And a lot of schools are using circles and other kinds of, there's other processes, community conferencing and things that I don't have, or family group conferencing. But it often uses a talking piece, and it helps people talk about individually, without arguing, their perspective or their story. And I can tell you that it's been very effective in the schools. And in fact, I was talking to a professor at Marquette a couple of weeks ago, and she was telling me her son goes to, I think, Glen Hills Middle School in Glendale, and that they use a lot of restorative justice at the school. I haven't been over there, but her son was bullied and actually physically attacked a little bit, and wanted to use some restorative justice, and she said, I want him kicked out of schools, the other kid, you know, mom was mad, and understandably, and they convinced her to let them try it, and they, you know, whatever happened, the boys are both still in school now, and they're not best friends. I mean, they're not hugging each other and spending overnights with each other, but they're not fighting, and her son feels comfortable in the school. He doesn't feel that he's under threat. And so schools, whether it's, whether it's the nutsiness we have where kids don't come to school or they're truant and then we suspend them so they get to spend more time at home, has not worked. And I can tell you that we worked with some alternative schools in Milwaukee that had some pretty tough kids, and we did some training with them and stuff, and I was doing a public radio interview along with one of the kids from the school when he was, I think, a senior, and he said, we used to go out in the playground and fight, and now somebody yells, let's circle up. And that is the reaction. There are teachers in some schools, in Minneapolis and other places, that do a circle every morning with their kids. And the reason they do it is the check-in with kids, because sometimes, and I was a sixth grade teacher, so I know what this is like. Some days, some kids are just out of sorts, right? They're causing trouble. They're causing trouble with other students. And if there can be a check-in with kids in the morning to find out how they're doing, even if they don't share exactly what happened in their house last night, you've got kids that have search warrants being executed in their houses, or parents that are being arrested, or domestic violence, or drugs being used. And it's not that we're trying to elicit that information, but you want to elicit the information that's disturbing the kid, because if the room knows, if the kids know, and the teacher knows that somebody's having a really tough time, they're going to treat that kid differently during the day than somebody who's just acting up and they're going to punish. And actually, the students actually find themselves actually sort of, becoming closer and better supportive of each other. We have done a number of circles like that on major discipline cases at Marquette University. At one point, there was a lot of publicity about this, so not what we did, but there was a lot of talk at one point that the basketball team was being suspected of engaging in sexual misconduct with some of the girls on campus. And I don't know if you remember all that, but there was a question of whether it was being reported to the police and what should be reported to the district attorney, and there was a lot of things going on. And after that all kind of went, they kind of worked that out and worked out a protocol with the police department. We did a circle with the entire basketball team, with all the coaches at Marquette, the then president of the university, and I brought in 2 women who were survivors of acquaintance sexual assault. One of them had been assaulted at Marquette by an athlete, and she had never reported it. The other one was assaulted by a friend of her brother, and she had never reported it. And those survivors got to do what we do in the prison, to tell their story about the impact. And one of the things that struck the players the most, which I thought was interesting, the one who was the young woman, and she's married married to a faculty member in a different part of the state and has a couple of kids. But she was describing that she was a virgin, and this guy suddenly attacked her, and she had gone to his apartment, which she said was a mistake, and she tried to jump out of the window, and he yanked her by her hair and threw her on the ground, and then he assaulted her and pulled on her hair. And she said to the circle, "To this day, I cannot have my sons climb on my lap and play with my hair. The minute they start, I push them off." Well, it's funny because if you think about basketball players, at least college-level basketball players, many of them are very close to their mothers. Mothers are very important in their lives. And they were really struck by the fact that this mother was not able to fully embrace her sons because of what somebody did in college. And they were really, they were trying to encourage her to be able to love her sons and things. And, but it was really interesting because, all we're doing in that circle is trying to get people to understand the harm that happens, not whether you violated the rule or what the law is or whether there's an arrest, the harm to people. And when people realize the harm they've committed to others, we all do it. I'm going to tell you one last story, and then I'll stop talking, Corinthia, and you can take questions. But this is the example I give, and we've done it, by the way, unsportsmanlike behavior with athletic teams and coaches. We've done all sorts of other, you name where there's harm going on, we've done circles. But the example I give, I used to drive to the prison and think, okay, why don't these guys get how much harm they've caused? And I always try to bring it back to me because the world is about me, right? So I think about it and I think, I get too busy. I was telling Corinthia, I had a speech at noon today, I got a speech tomorrow morning, I had a speech on Friday, so, I get too busy, and once in a while, something slips through and I don't show up, which is not a good thing. And my reaction, I'm probably not unfamiliar to others, is to be really angry and perhaps to take it out on my secretary, right? Somehow she should have told me, should have reminded me, should have been big on my calendar, whatever. Actually, the woman who runs my calendar now is very good at that. Maybe she's heard me tell this story, and I might go in and just kind of, give it to her that she should have done more, and, it's partially her fault that I missed this. I might go home that night and think, I shouldn't have done that. It was my fault. I screwed up. It wasn't her fault. Gee, I feel bad about it. I'm going to buy some flowers on the way. I'm going to go to Sundix, get some flowers in the morning, and take them to the office and tell her I'm sorry. Good things, right? Good things. I do not think about what happened to her when she left the office. I do not think about the fact she may have gone home and yelled at her children or had a fight with her partner, and that she worried that maybe she was going to be fired or have discipline. Because we don't think about the people we've had an argument with, we think about ourselves. And even when the next day I say I'm sorry, we've got a power imbalance going because I'm an employer and she's an employee, that she may still worry that it may happen again, that I might lose my temper again. And so we all impact people in the negative in things we do, sometimes mindfully and sometimes not. And it really is the chance for people to tell their stories and to understand. One more story. We did a number of stories in the Central City for about 2 years. We were part of a big Department of Justice grant. And we were doing a circle on the north side on Martin Luther King Drive. And we had we had some moms whose sons had been murdered. We had some moms whose sons were in prison. We had some people who had just got out of prison. We had some community members, and we had Milwaukee police officers. Every one of the circles we brought in Milwaukee police officers. By the way, the chief is having us come in and do training for the police officers this summer, so I'm very excited about that. But I had officers there. And the question I asked is, how has violence impacted your life? Well, everybody can answer that, even if it's that you live in Whitefish Bay because it's safer than living in the city of Milwaukee. Or, I mean, that may be a simpler answer. You may have faced some real violence, whether by a relative or a neighbor or somebody you know. And so people tell the stories of violence. And I'm just going to share with you this one Milwaukee police officer. He was a white officer, and he was sitting, and he took the talking piece, and he started talking, and he said, a few years ago, I was called to a shooting in the city of Milwaukee, he said, and I got there, I was the first officer on the scene, and people were screaming and yelling and just running around, and I kept saying, what happened, what happened? And they said, there's a shooting in that house. And he said, so he described running up the steps and pulling out his gun and going into the house, and there was a little baby, I don't know, 4 or 6 months old, with a bullet hole in her head. And he picked her up in his arms, and he sits in the circle with the talking piece with his arms, and he said, I held her, and he said, I could hear the screaming and the sirens and everything outside, but yet I was just present to this child who took her last breath in my arms. And he said, I think about her, I dream about her, I've talked to doctors and nurses, is there something I could have done? And they tell me no. And then he looked at the circle and said, I want you to know that every time I get called to a shooting in the city of Milwaukee, I take her with me. There's nobody that left that room that day that could say that officer doesn't care. And it is that storytelling that can change people's hearts and perceptions of people they have to deal with. And so that's why I'm a fan of restorative justice. And I'll take questions.
So I've got a mic here so I can pass it around. I've got a question, though.
Sure.
So typically when you have a victim and an offender meet, is that just a one-time meeting, or do they sometimes meet several times or form a relationship?
Usually on the crimes of severe violence, it's a one-time meeting. Now, I will tell you that there are cases, there have been a couple on homicide by intoxicated users where the family wants to continue to visit. You know, they've sort of built sort of a relationship. I didn't mention this, and I guess about 50% of the cases, the victim survivor often hugs the offender at the end. I mean, it's really pretty amazing. But, you know, on the other hand, there's a court in Madison, it's called a Restorative Justice Court, and they are young men, there may be young women too, but primarily young men, many of them men of color, that get charged with, selected for ordinance violations, but they are not formally charged, and they get referred to this court by police officers and prosecutors and things. And they go into that court, and they sit in a circle with community members on several times. That's why I'm going to answer your question. And the community, you know, there are a lot of these things don't have victims, right? Classical victims, drug dealing, other kinds of things, sort of, you know, generic things that they think nobody's harmed, but yes, you know the people are harmed. So the community plays that voice with them, and they meet and they talk, and as long as the young man wants to admit that he did what he did and is part of this, they give him some tasks to accomplish. We do this in the Milwaukee County DA's office. We want you to get your high school diploma, we want you to make this restitution, we want you to do this, and they meet several times. And the outcome in Madison is that they never get formally charged. There's no arrest record, there's no nothing. So these young men have a better chance at trying to get a job and make it in the community. In Milwaukee County, they've had a restorative justice unit in the DA's office for over 20 years. And although it wasn't often a dismissal of a case, but it was often, you know, a 17-year-old that sells a nickel bag, they still call it that, of marijuana to somebody, that's a felony, an adult felony on a kid. And they would take those cases and the community would come out with some kinds of things that they had to do, and then they'd meet again. And many times prosecutors would agree either to reduce it or to dismiss it if they met those conditions. So you adjust it, but on the serious crimes, you really prep it for the one meeting.
Other question?
I'm just wondering for the incarcerated offenders, if you do any follow-up after to see, you know, when they are released, did it make a difference? Do you follow up with them while they're incarcerated?
No, that's a good question. I can tell you a couple of things, and all are anecdotal except one. The one that's not anecdotal is that St. Norbert's followed up on a number of the people that went through our program and looked at the number of times they had discipline issues in the prison before and after, and they dropped significantly. Anecdotally, I will tell you that I work with a number of groups, including with Mary Trigiano, with people who have been recently released from prison on some serious charges. I've been in with 3 different groups in the last 4 months, and in every group that I've been in, there have been 1 or 2 guys who had been in the program when I was at Green Bay. You know, it's kind of not the full circle piece of it. I can tell you the studies have been done with juveniles. That's where really the studies have been done on the victim offender kind of things with juveniles. And in those cases, recidivism drops substantially. And even if they're committing a crime, it's usually a lesser crime. Restitution rates go way up, and the victim satisfaction is much higher than when they go to court. So, there has to be more studies. That's one of the things that we're hoping with our center, and we're working with some of the faculty and other divisions at Marquette to see if we can't do more outcome studies that are more than my storytelling, so.
I have a similar question to the one that was just asked, but about the victims. Have you ever, imagine that the process is so carefully considered before the meeting takes place, but have you ever encountered a time when it actually went worse for the victim, like there was any regrets around
No.
the meeting?
No, but we spend so much time with them. And we really manage expectations. And there are times I call it, and I tell them I have the right at any point to say this is not going to work. And I may not tell you why, because sometimes, I can tell you the most complicated ones is where the victim and the offender knew each other. There may have been some power imbalance. There may have been some domestic violence in addition to whatever else is there. And those are really complicated because it's one thing if you're dealing with one incident. It's another if you've had all sorts of interaction, and those can be very challenging. I'm in favor of using them. We didn't have time to talk about this on domestic violence cases, but they have to be done very carefully. I have said long, and frankly, the people at Sojourner Truth believe likewise. We say we don't want to do it in domestic violence because of the power imbalance and the risks to the survivor, but the alternative is, maybe Mary talked about this in the last session, but over half of the cases never go to anything. The survivor decides she doesn't want to go ahead, she reunites with the guy, or she goes out, and I always say it's better if you could have a facilitated dialogue, even though it may be challenging, rather than have them both meet in a bar on a Friday night after 3 beers each. And, people are going to see each other anyway, so maybe we ought to figure out a way to facilitate some kind of dialogue that can set some kind of limits and things. So that's still, people have done different things. They've done surrogates, they've done different, all over the world, trying to work on domestic violence. But I do think it's something that has to happen because, a lot of women, for a variety of reasons, and very valid to them, don't want to go ahead with the criminal prosecution, and then they're at risk.
I actually have a follow-up question, and that is as familiar as I am with this process, I'm not familiar with being a surrogate, and I'm wondering whether in the work that you've done, you've noticed that it's like more effective or less effective for them to act as a surrogate versus confronting their perpetrator directly.
The surrogates like I use in the circles, is that what you're asking? It has a profound impact on dealing with your specific survivor. And, I've had offenders tell the prison staff it's the best thing they've ever done. To be able to tell their story, to listen to it, and to be able to work through that. They've never, the court proceeding doesn't accomplish that. And they really, I've been amazed, and I have followed up with a number of the people that have gone through it, and I've never had anybody regret it. The advantage of the circle with the surrogates are, one, you can do it with a lot more people, and two, it's not as much work to prepare. Because when you're preparing two people to deal with a particular incident that happened to both of them, if they were both involved, it's pretty intensive. Whereas if you got a survivor telling one story, and so, you know, we were processing twice a year, 25 men through that program, so 50 men a year that would go through that 3-day program. And they were part of a semester-long course that had other aspects. We're going to do the same thing at Racine, and so you're able to expose a lot more people to it, and you don't have the prep time. And I can tell you that a number of these survivors, including the ones that I described to you, had never any interest in meeting with their particular offenders. They didn't, and that's, I get it. But they love being able to tell their stories in the circle. The sexual assault survivor that I told you about, the school teacher, her husband is a dentist, and she stayed married. She said, we had one of the few marriages that made it, because a lot of survivors of sexual assault relationships break apart after a rape. But she said she brought her husband once after she'd done this a number of times, and he sat in the circle and he didn't tell the men or the others that he was the husband of the woman who was talking until the end. And he was so moved by how respectful all these men were to his wife in telling that story, and he told them that. You know, and we had a good discussion, because one of the things that's big with crime is that there's often a revenge factor. If you've sexually assaulted my niece, I'm going to get you. Or if you shot my brother, I'm going to shoot you. And so we really talk through that whole issue of revenge, because all that does is create a whole other line of victims, right? Then you have the mother of the guy who gets revenge and now has her son in prison, or the children don't have their father. And the percentage of children who wind up in prison of incarcerated offenders is huge. And so we spend a lot of time talking to that. But there's nothing more impactful than the two meeting on a particular offense.
I'm interested in the application in the schools, and who conducts the circle in the school? Is it a trained guidance counselor in restorative justice practice, or how does that really play out in a school system?
It really depends on the school. Let me tell you what at Washington High School in Milwaukee, and I don't know that they still do it, but they actually had a class in restorative justice, and they picked out some leaders out of the high school. And I don't mean leaders in the sense that they're on a roll and captain of the football team. They were leaders that people listened to them. And they put them in that class and they trained them, and they actually became the facilitators for the school. And they would do circles. There would always be a faculty member in the room just to make sure that it was okay, but the students were leading it. Teachers are trained. There are schools all over the country that consider themselves restorative schools, and they train the teachers. Some are guidance counselors. I am working right now with a Catholic school in a different state that had some sexual abuse by one of the teachers, and but they are trying to turn the whole school into a restorative school. So they want to go beyond just dealing with this. They deal with everything from dealing with a suicide, where you want to bring students together, to discipline, to other kinds of things. And I went down and trained some of the students and trained some of the teachers. They're going to go look at some other schools. Usually there's a point person within the school that sort of oversees this and, you know, maintains the standards and checks that it's going. But lots of teachers participate. Sometimes it's psychologists, sometimes it's the guidance counselors. It just depends on the particular school. And as I said, a student who can lead a circle is, especially at the high school level, is really a very nice way to go, because the students listen to each other.
I have two questions for you.
Okay.
Can you tell me what percentage of the restorative practices are being done that you know of? What percentage, because we know it's very carceral, but what percentage of the restorative practices are currently being done that you know of?
Or currently, I didn't hear the end of it.
What percentage? Is it 2%,
Percentage of cases?
3%? Yeah, of cases that are coming through either juvenile or the adult system?
It's not a large percentage. It's more than it used to be. It's increasing. You know, and some of the things that Mary Trujano was here too, they're trying to increase more restorative approaches in some of the treatment courts. As I said, the district attorney's office has had a unit for some time. You know, there are different ways. You know, I noticed, and I live up in Bayside, and I haven't taken the time to go over to the police department, but you know, I read my little newsletter. And one of the things that I read is that they've got one of their officers who offers to mediate neighborhood conflicts. And in its own way, you know, depending how she does it, it's a woman, it can be very restorative, you know, a way of developing conversations. You know, it's funny, I don't know if you saw, I hate to even bring this up because I don't like talking about it, but this god-awful last Supreme Court race. But one of the ads involved, it sounded like a survivor complaining about a sentence that Judge Potasewicz had given, and among other things, and it was a horrific ad. But she spoke up, the real victim spoke up and said, I told them not to use the ad. But what she said was, I told the judge I wanted restorative justice. I thought it was really interesting. And she was not unhappy with the sentence that Judge Potasewicz had given, despite the fact that the other side used it against her. I think that there are more and more lawyers. It took a while to get public defenders and defense counsel on board because they thought, oh, our client's going to say something and we're going to get in trouble. But, you know, we've gotten to the point that people that in the criminal justice system, most of those cases are going to plead to something eventually anyway, and better that they get into a program where they get connected to the community and maybe go on the path of trying to repair some of the harm and then be sentenced if they're going to be sentenced or have the case dismissed than not to do it. And so public defenders in particular are pretty in favor of it. Part of the problem is, you know, everything I've done is pro bono. I don't charge for what I do. And there's not money for it, so that's the other problem, right? So the people have to be trained, they have to be volunteers, but community volunteers all over the country are trained to do this work, often retired people and other people. You certainly don't have to be a lawyer to do this work. Sometimes that's an impediment, frankly, and certainly a judge is an impediment. But, you know, it's not a large percentage. It's growing. And I think it's going to grow even more because we're doing restorative justice in the schools. And when those kids start getting to be young adults, going to law school, going into the community, and know about restorative justice, there's going to be more of it.
What could we do as constituents to, you talked about the schools as a way of getting restorative practices out there. What could we do to see what needs to be done in our own school districts or our local schools so that this is happening as a constituent?
Well, what I can tell you, and if somebody's interested, you certainly can contact me. I've got students that can help provide materials. What I've seen successful is when a small community group of leaders involving school officials, maybe school board members, maybe principals, maybe teachers, but also community leaders, whether it's someone from the Rotary Club and someone from the local church or someone, you know, other people of influence in the community get together and decide that they want to try a project. Now, you know, there's probably going to need to be some funding for it to do some training and get some other things done. But that Oshkosh had a really good restorative justice program for a while, and I think I don't know that it's still continuing, but it was really just a network of people. Another place that had restorative justice for a very longer than I've been doing it is Barron, Wisconsin, of all places. And they had everything from schools to police department to neighborhoods to the courts, and there was restorative being used everywhere. There are certain police departments that try to use restorative, particularly with juveniles. But I think to see that there's community support for it is the best approach.
I'm just going to do a follow-up question. So if a group wanted to learn about restorative justice and try to actually implement it, where would they go for training?
Well, there are some trainings available. There's actually, if somebody is real interested, there's some short training going on. Actually, there's a group called Catholic Mobilizing, which is out of Washington. It's a group I've worked with. And that group is really the arm of Sister Prejean, who worked on anti-death penalty work. But they have gotten into restorative justice, and I saw that there's a priest on the south side of Chicago. I went to visit him at Precious Blood Parish, and he works with, in that high homicide area of Chicago with all the gangs and things, and does restorative justice training. And I saw that they're doing a training online. I think it's free. There are trainings available. I think that the center, which we've just established, we just got our grant last year to permanently endow the center, we are going to be offering training. We're doing our first training this summer, and we're doing it with some members of law enforcement and other people at Marquette right now to do student-related issues, but I think we'll probably be offering too. You have to look. There is a National Association of Community and Restorative Justice, and there's a website, and it's not very expensive to belong in, but they do trainings as well.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Bravo that the penal system is, I think, moving in the direction it was originally started, so that there is restoration and change in people's behaviors. Has your group integrated into any of the leadership camps that they have for junior and senior high students? They get selected or they volunteer to go to these camps. And I did not see it at the camp, but it might be a great way to.
They just have to ask, right? That's how we show up. I don't go out and today I was doing this Zoom with the Appleton Bar Association, and they said, well, how do we contact you? And I said, this isn't a marketing event. I'm just telling you about it. But we will at Marquette. Mary's going to head it up, and she's younger than I am and has more energy at this point. I'm not going to completely go away, but we will help you in the fall. We're going to have some clinical students and as well as the course, and it's a matter of asking. We do presentations quite frequently, and I love doing young people because it's the future, right? And if they learn how to, we have failed as adults to be able to communicate and listen to each other, as a general people, maybe not individually, but generally. And I'm really hopeful that we can kind of turn this around. It's the old expression, when you have a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. Well, to me, the whole world needs a circle. Whether it's Congress or whoever, they need to sit down with the talking piece and really listen to each other and to have some communication. But I think, it's a matter of inviting. I can just give you another example. I once did a circle with pro-life, pro-choice people, right? Those are students who were at each other's throats, literally. And what we did was we focused on what they had in common, and that they cared about children and babies, and they did some joint projects together. Now, we were never going to solve how people feel about, abortion. But a friend of mine did it with adults in Boston over 2 years, and the individuals in that process agreed not to use certain language when they refer to the other group. You can do all sorts of creative things with people, even if it's not getting to the heart of the difference, because we're always going to have differences of views and opinions. So,
Any other questions?
I think our timing is perfect. There is just no way I can thank you enough. I was at that circle with a police officer and his story about the baby, and that remains in my mind when I'm reading the newspaper and I'm hearing various arguments about defunding the police or any kind of rhetoric like that, and it sticks with you. Thank you so much. I invite all of us to join in some coffee and some delicious chocolate-looking brownies in the narthex, and maybe continue conversations. But this has been tremendous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.